after that, everyone fails for the most part in comparison. What I do want to talk about today is the idea of what we face in terms of validating in an operational laboratory the things that academicians produce. They're typically lovely things, but there's typically a huge gap between, as Paul and many others have said, there's this gap between their understanding and solution for a problem and how that transfers or translates into something that is, as our friend from the Met Lab said, 47,000 objects of evidence in a year, or if you're in toxicology, a month. The idea of scale is significant, and there are other problems that arise with that as well. I suspect that I was selected because I'm known as a hybrid, and I don't give myself that particular term, but when it was given to me and explained, I accepted it, which is that I am in fact a forensic scientist. I've been to hundreds of crime scenes, testified hundreds of times, looked at thousands or tens of thousands of items of evidence, but I'm also an academic. I currently teach, and so I have feet in both worlds, and I think I have at least two of the three circles that that Paul had there in terms of where the dialogue has to happen. I certainly don't have the law part of it, which is why that dialogue is really essential. So I do have, that's not a misspelling, collaborateurs in here. Nora Rudin, Kirk Lohmuller, and Claire Marsden have all assisted in the type of work that I'm going to talk about today. I think this, here's what I'd like to cover in the time that I have. And by the way, I know I stand between you and tea, so I won't make this terribly painful. Why should we validate? Why does this even come up? As an academician, you solve a problem and say, okay, on to the next one. That was fun. You know, can I do something more interesting? And you may, but there's really much more to do from a pragmatic perspective. The next question is, what should we validate? And that's not particularly easy when we're talking about complex DNA samples. I will tell you what standards have been proposed for these probabilistic genotyping software solutions. There are not many. I will try to define a little bit what I mean by validation. And my proposal that sort of summarizes much of what the proposed standards have done. I will talk to you about constructing a data set that might serve as sort of a baseline for on which many of these solutions can work, and then talk a little bit about preliminary results. If this slide works properly, and there's some question about that, it's just to give you an idea that I've had my hand in all of these things, from the crime scene, and I think, from the crime scene. I really do know what to do with that bloody pair of, and by the way, in front of this audience, I know I need to call those trousers, because when someone else made the mistake of calling them the American colloquial term, there was that same sort of snicker, but for the wrong reason. This didn't come out very well. This is actually supposed to be an electropharogram. There's a little bit of the mathematical modeling, and here actually is the software implementation. And so I've actually had my hands in all of that, and it's the only reason I think that I can actually stand in front of you and say a little bit. Why do we need to validate, and I'm going to talk very specifically about DNA and complex DNA samples, and the solutions that have been proposed, the mathematical solutions that have been proposed to handle the complexity that we see. So if you have a fairly simple sample, and this is a simple sample for those of you who have not seen much DNA work, you know, these are genetic locations, and they're characterized by either one or two peaks, if you will, one from mom, one from dad. There's a little bit of variation, not a lot. This one is a fairly simple thing to interpret and move ahead on. If you get a little more complicated, then what happens, you start to see things like mixtures. So now you'll see that there are 3 or maybe 4 peaks at a locus, which indicates, and I know this is a ground truth sample, this is actually a mixture of 2 individuals, but the peaks are still relatively robust, and for the most part, we don't have too much trouble interpreting that. Well, this is the difference between a Mac and a PC. And this is all too bad. So if you kind of do this, you might be able to make your way through it. I'll direct your attention sideways to this mess right here, which this is actually noise and a very complex sample. And if we are to move ahead, yeah, none of that's going to make any sense. We move ahead to 3 and 4 person mixtures, and this is where I have to ask you to trust me on my computer. It actually looks lovely. But it becomes a mess. Things are not there that should be, things are there that shouldn't be, and how do you actually handle that when you have a very complex mixture? In particular, one of the reasons that we have this difficulty is that when the original individuals who were responsible for deciding what genetic loci we were going to examine, when they made decisions about that, they used only moderately heterozygous loci, which I know is a big mouthful, and 3 or 4 of you understand that, but fundamentally what it means is that there's a lot of genetic sharing between even unrelated individuals. And so it's very difficult to tease out whether individual 1 was responsible for type 1, 2, or type 1 and 3, or type 1 and 4, or none of them. And so we needed some solution to sort of parse through that. In addition, there are other reasons besides just the technical ones for the need to validate. A recent decision in the state of New York for a defendant by the name of Hillary actually declined, the judge declined to admit evidence from one of the proposed solutions. And I do want to say as my caveat that I haven't seen the evidence, I know nothing about the case, and that's not my point, which is why I really don't name what those pieces of software are, because it doesn't matter. What matters is what the judge saw and what he thought. And what he thought is that based on all of the evidence that has been presented to me, the prosecution has failed to demonstrate that what's being used has been internally validated. That's kind of it's a buzzword, and I'll explain it in a little bit, but the idea that a judge is concerned about validation is a reason for us to be concerned about validation. He goes on to say, in addition, not only that there was an issue, this is the judge now, I'm not making any representation for myself, not only is there a problem with validation, but there was some lack of training, that it was not clear to him that the personnel had actually been trained properly. And so there are legal issues as well as technical issues for really wanting to understand how good these methods are. And so one of the upshots of all of this, and it has been around for a while, although validation documents, guidelines have existed only for a couple of years now, I will point to 3. I will not confess to know every one that's ever been written, but I think that there are 3 important ones. The first one is the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods. I wasn't around for the coining of that particular acronym. And they issued an approved set of guidelines for the validation of probabilistic genotyping systems. And if it hasn't been clear up to now, that's the name given to the math and software solutions, probabilistic genotyping software or systems. So they issued guidelines in June of 2015. Hinda Hanad and colleagues also published something in Science and Justice in 2016. And full disclosure, I'm part of the et al. So I was a part of that work as well. And then the DNA Commission of the International Society for Forensic Genetics also published recommendations on how to validate this PGS stuff. And there are many notable individuals in addition to the lead author, Mike Coble. And then, as has been mentioned a bit earlier, PCAST weighed in as well. And PCAST has been the subject of some very blistering criticism about the report that they issued. Interestingly enough, and this is just a side story, the report was issued and a press conference was held at the time of a conference for this particular work. And everyone was off at dinner, but I didn't have a dinner ticket, so I actually listened to it streaming live. And afterwards, I was the most popular person here. It's like, what did they say? What did they say?
We were listening to it at dinner.
Yeah, perhaps. Were you? Okay. All right. So here's what all of these say in common, and I will say this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. This is my view of not only what they have in common, but what I think are the important things that they have in common, and I'll talk about each of them in turn. All of them indicate that there needs to be an explicit publication of whatever that model is. And that publication has to be sufficient for any mathematician or statistician to be able to understand what is being done, including explicating all of the assumptions and everything that goes into building a mathematical model. If that's not done, clearly we're back to what Paul has said, perhaps we're not doing science if some of it has to be secret. They all agree that there needs to be testing against ground truth samples, and I'll talk a little bit about our effort in that particular regard, but the idea, and why that's necessary, but the idea of having a common set of samples against which any mathematical model and or software implementation can be tested is really crucial to understanding the broad ability and or limitation of any particular solution. Finally, they all say, in one form or another, this particular phrase, and I really like it, it should be fit for purpose. The other way of looking at that phrase is that it's not fit for all purposes. And that idea of a limitation is really critical and is why, in my view, and many others as well, that testing against ground truth samples is one way of assisting us in understanding for what purpose any solution is actually fit. So let's talk about the SWGDAM guidelines. And again, I'm abstracting some stuff. These are all long documents, and I certainly don't have the time to go through all of them. One of the interesting things from my perspective about this particular set of guidelines is that they actually based it on a model not a mathematical model, but essentially an outline that had been established years before for laboratory work. In other words, when DNA methods were first being proposed, SWGDAM introduced guidelines for how a laboratory should go about validating their laboratory work. And so it's a lab bench model that I think there's trying to shoehorn into an area that it's not quite it's not the same. Computer mathematical modeling is really not the same as doing a laboratory instrumental analysis. And I think I'll show a little bit of that, or at least talk about it in just a bit. One of the things that they did early on, that is in those earlier iterations, is they make a distinction between developmental and internal validation. You'll notice that the judge in the Hillary case talked about internally validated software. And where that comes from is the idea that laboratory instruments and reagent kits that are bought from a manufacturer actually have some inherent variability from lab to lab. And so the capillary electrophoresis instruments that are used to produce the electropherograms that didn't come out very well in some of my slides, they actually have different sensitivities in different laboratories. And so the developer, the manufacturer of that instrument, can't just say, you can expect to detect 3 picograms of DNA. Every laboratory has to establish for themselves what their sensitivity is, as one example. And so early on, Swigdam properly differentiated between developmental, what does the manufacturer have to demonstrate through theoretical publications and their own validation work, and what does every laboratory have to do to say that it's fit for their purpose with their samples that they collect in their land. The Swigdam guidelines are very detailed with regard to what kind of complexity is modeled. But sort of my view of that is, well, what if the next piece of probabilistic genotyping software chooses to model some other bit of complexity that you haven't included there? And so I think it's a little too specific because it really just gets up to a particular point and doesn't really seem to allow for any future development. And I think that fundamentally it really fails to appreciate the difference between lab-based validation and mathematical model validation. As I said, an instrument can really vary from lab to lab, but a computer is not. Every computer, with the rare exception of that floating point problem that I think mostly has disappeared, if we're old enough to remember that, you know, if you ask a computer to add 2 plus 2 and anywhere in the world, it better get 4, unless you're an attorney and then it's 3 or some other, right? Sorry. That's always my jab that I have to get in it, Paul. So one of the incredibly impractical things that they've asked laboratories to do is to compare the new model to past interpretation protocols, which has always been heuristic. And it's like there's this complete disconnect, it seems to me, in terms of how that might be done. And I think I've already made this particular point. Talking about Hinda and her group, one of the things that I really liked about her approach is that she didn't take the validation of probabilistic genotyping as somehow a brand new problem that we have to make up from scratch. Rather, she looked into the literature about other disciplines that have had this and struggled with the same problem of model and software validation efforts, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. We also recognize the difference between the model itself and the implementation of that model via a piece of software. So the model says what the math is supposed to do, and that's conceptual validation. Implementation says how to do the math, and that's really programming it into a computer. And here are 2, I think, really essential points for anyone looking at the idea of mathematical modeling of complex DNA samples. There is not and never will be a totally objective and accepted approach to model validation. And that doesn't come from DNA people, that comes from mathematical modeling people who have from a wide variety of disciplines. But very specific to DNA testing, and this is one that most jurists will hate. No gold standards exists in the form of a true likelihood ratio that will be able to serve as a comparison for all of the models. So we're kind of at a disadvantage out of the gate. There's no middle of the target. And that creates conversation, to be polite. And then the commission, the DNA commission, I think brings out some very good points that I like very much that the others really did not talk about. They're very good about talking about what to do with software, things like version control, what to do with updates, notification of users, of quality assurance issues that have been detected, bugs, for example. And this is one I love, The emphasis on knowledge and training of the users, which is Paul's entire talk, and I think I'll say a little bit more about this later, the idea of training the user is bedrock to anything that we try to do with regard to validation. It's not merely enough to say that the software works is fit for whatever purpose. If the wrong input because of bad training goes into a legitimate piece of software, you will get the wrong answer. And so the person using it cannot be, as our MetLab person talked about, the police personnel, they can't be undertrained. They have to have an intimate knowledge of how this works. However, why did most people in a laboratory become a forensic DNA analyst? Because they have a degree in biology. And they probably had one class in bioinformatics and one class in statistics, maybe. That's who you have to train to understand a very sophisticated piece of mathematical modeling. And so the challenge is not just jurists, it's the people doing it as well. In fact, most of the people who understand what's going on are sitting in this room and a few other rooms around the world and nowhere else. And validation must understand that particular problem. If you want to be in the United States, according to other SWGDAM guidelines, what's known as a DNA analyst, and everything is capitalized there so you know that it's really important, right, as opposed to just a DNA analyst, you have to have 9 semester units in statistics and/or molecular biology. So if you get 2 classes in statistics from your biologist, you are a lucky lab manager, because you've got to have at least 1 in MOBI.
That's in the US?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not here.
I think I tried to say that. These are SWGDAM guidelines, right. And then we have the PCAST commentary. They do admit, hey, these look really good, but they talk about validation. They say, look, we're still early in the game here, and part of what needs to happen is to define the limitations on their reliability. In other words, we have to know where the errors occur and under what circumstances, and we have to know whether the software correctly implements the methods. I think neither one of those are particularly controversial. This one, however, is, at least to some. The evaluation of the proposed method should consist of studies by a whole bunch of people not associated with the ones who actually wrote it. So, and by the way, the red is mine, but the italics are theirs. So there's some emphasis that they put on the idea of software developers can't be the only ones who are responsible for validating the model. And I think there's a little bit more before I editorialize. They do note that at least in the literature up to the time that they published it, which is 2 months ago, very few comparative studies across the methods to evaluate what differences occur. Remember, there's no gold standard, so all the methods are actually going to give slightly different answers if the model is a little bit different. And in particular, they point out again that there are no comparative studies conducted by independent groups. Now, I will say that as I understand it, I'll admit this is a bit apocryphal, at least in one case, that those who have proprietary software have actually met with PCAST members to argue that this is all wrong-headed. And they really need to sort of repudiate that and back up a little bit. What I would offer is that in the news, even within the last week, we have hackers conferences and bug conferences where people are paid a bounty to find a bug in a piece of software or a website or something of that sort. And we should understand that the reason that that exists is because the people who have written the software didn't write it specifically with a bug or a problem in it. They wrote it as best they could, but they recognize that there's a limit to any human endeavor. And the more people that we have, the more likely we are to actually capture the limits. So, I will try to define validation as a process, first of all, that makes some explicit statement about how the model is going to behave, and then hopefully the software as well. And for what we're doing here, that might mean the implementation of this model that we do in the software is valid for our casework subject to these limitations. And the limitations can be an amount of DNA, it can be the degree of complexity that is detected. All of those need to be established through the validation process and results in this kind of document. I think I want to just show this as a standard plan for model and software validation because I have less time than I need, which is my fault, not anybody else's. I'll just briefly show that, and this will be posted so you can look at it a little more carefully, and I'm going to jump through all of that. To talk about the set of complex mixtures, a data set that I have assisted in creating. There are 2, 3, and 4 person mixtures. The mixture ratios include those 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 4 to 1, and 9 to 1 because these are the ones that, based on previous studies, have shown to be the most problematic. And the total DNA has gone from 500 all the way down to 30 picograms total, which means that the highest amount of DNA from any one person is 250 picograms, and the lowest is 3, which is half of a diploid cell. So we really tried to stress the system in that way. These are the complexity variables that I tried to model. I combined homozygosity and heterozygosity in different ways between the major and the minor, or the major, major, minor, minor, or the major, minor, you get the idea, depending on how many people we have in there. Fundamentally, then, we had 160 conditions. That's all of these. 160 of those. We did 5 replicates of every condition. So we're trying to give some statistical power here. And so we had 800 total samples. Elsewhere, I ran them, or they were run in a discrete system that David Balding developed, and we turned into a piece of software called Lab Retriever. And then here, while I was at the Newton Institute, I ran those same samples in like LTD, which is a more comprehensive model. And then some of the results. This is what I have. So I've compared the likelihood ratios of Lab Retriever here, the discrete method, to the quantitative like LTD over here, and you find that there are some values that are actually below. This is a log likelihood, so it's either less than 1 or less than 0, depending on how you're going to do that, and that's of course troubling. You don't want true contributors to have likelihood ratios that point to exclusion, but this is an example of a limitation of a piece of software. And this is, I think, exactly what validation is supposed to do. Interestingly enough, at the same conference, unbeknownst to each other, 2 other individuals had exactly the same results. David Balding, on a much smaller data set, showed that he also would get some likelihood ratios that are in the wrong direction. And Peter Gill, this is a screenshot of a video, unfortunately, but Peter Gill in this area here also found exactly the same thing. And the point to all of that is that when you have 3 independent people looking at 3 different sets of material, finding the same thing means you probably have a trend, and we're starting to get towards this idea of validation. In the interest of getting you to tea on time, I have a detailed slide there, but we can look at that a little bit later. What we hope to continue to do is to explore those conditions under which models will yield likelihood ratios less than 1 for true contributors, to strengthen and expand the collaborative efforts. There are several people here who have evinced an interest in looking at this data set with their own model, and now we can put that together and find out something of what the PCAST was actually interested in doing. These are the people that I've talked with who are interested. One of the key points of this is to make sure that this data set is publicly available, and when it's all set, we will publish and make available the data for that to happen. eventually we want a set of known non-contributors to see how the software will actually work for likelihood ratios that should be significantly less than 1, and to see how much overlap there is. And so the final slide is that I really can't express my gratitude strongly enough for our excellent hosts, not merely the Turing Gateway, but also the 4 who actually put this together. I told you I'd embarrass you. Thank you very much.